All right, so here we're going to talk about commas. Comma use can be confusing. However, there is an easy test to see whether or not you need to insert a comma in a sentence, and that is that often you can tell whether or not you need to insert a comma in a sentence by reading the sentence aloud and noting the places where you pause. This doesn't work every time, but it will work sometimes, and it works enough of the time to avoid some major errors. The best thing, though, is to know the actual rules of comma use and be able to apply them. So, first, let's talk about coordinating conjunctions. We've done this a bit at the beginning of the year when we were talking about compound sentences. With a compound sentence, you need to insert a coordinating conjunction. That's our and, but, or, for, nor, yet, so, or fanboys, as you guys often remember it. You use that coordinating conjunction with a comma in the middle of the compound sentence. So here you can see the comma right here in the middle of our sentence. We've got the coordinating conjunction and we've got our two independent clauses. That should be pretty straightforward for you. Another one that should be pretty straightforward is using a comma to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause in a complex sentence if and only if the dependent clause comes first. Remember, if the independent clause comes first, there's no comma in a complex sentence. So here we've got the dependent clause comes first, and we've got them separated with the comma. A new element is introductory word groups. You use a comma after an introductory word group. These word groups and their clauses or phrases, they often function as adverbs, giving some information about when, where, how, or why the rest of the sentence, the main action of the sentence, occurred. So in our example here, you see, sitting by my bedside, my alarm clock is essential to me being at school on time. My alarm clock is the subject of the sentence, and the introductory word group, sitting by my bedside, tells the reader where that alarm clock is. So you set that introductory word group off from the rest of the sentence with a comma. With items in a series, you separate them with a comma. So the brown side, a tackle, comma, a guard, comma, a wide receiver, comma, and a safety. There is a little bit of disagreement about this last comma in the series. It's what's often referred to as the Oxford comma, and some people will tell you that it is optional. My recommendation is to always use the Oxford comma. I think it clears up far more ambiguity or confusion than it causes. So I would say always use the Oxford comma between the last two items in a series, even though other people might argue that it's optional. There are two types of adjectives that we need to know about with regard to comma use. The two types of adjectives are called coordinate adjectives and cumulative adjectives. And the reason why it's important for us to know that there are two types is because they function different ways with regard to commas. With coordinate adjectives, we're talking about adjectives that each individually describe the noun. They can function on their own. You don't need both of them to make full sense out of the sentence. And the easiest way to test this is to insert and between them. So in our example, Tom is a bright and interested student. If you can insert and between the two adjectives, then they are coordinate, and you can replace that and with a comma. So our second example, Tom is a bright, comma, interested student. So coordinate adjectives function independently to modify the noun that they are modifying. On the other hand, cumulative adjectives work together. If they're taken separately, they don't work at all. So cumulative adjectives don't get commas because they have to work together. If you insert and, it doesn't make as much sense. So the example, I love the deep green leaves. The leaves themselves aren't deep. Deep is describing the green, not the leaves. So there's no comma here. You wouldn't say, I love the deep and green leaves. If the and test doesn't work, don't put a comma in. If the adjectives are modifying each other rather than the noun, don't put a comma in. With direct address, you use a comma to set off the nouns of the direct address, or to set off yes and no, or to set off interjections. So our first example, excuse me, comma, Mr. Fisher, comma, when does class end? The Mr. Fisher is set off because that shows that the speaker is directly addressing Mr. Fisher. In the second example, yes, comma, I did my homework. We set yeses and nos off from the rest of the sentence with a comma. And then any interjection, oops, darn it, anything that someone might shout out in reaction to something, we set off with a comma as well. We've been through this, but it bears noting that with direct quotations, after you introduce the speaker and the verb, you set the direct quotation off from the rest of the sentence with a comma. We've done this all year, so that shouldn't be new to you. With dates and addresses, we use commas to set off elements as well. With dates, the year is set off with a pair of commas from the rest of the sentence. The elements of an address are also followed by a comma. So our example here actually includes both. I was born on October 21st, comma, 1977, comma. So we've bracketed our year with commas, setting it off from the rest of the sentence. In Cleveland, comma, Ohio. So we've set off the state with commas as well. There's always a comma between city and state. There is a comma after state if you're going on with the rest of the sentence. There's also always a comma between the day and the year, and then a comma after the year if you're continuing with the rest of the sentence. With titles and numbers, we use commas as well. The first half of our slide is about title. So we've got titles after name, MD, DDO, Esquire, Junior, the third. If you have any of those, you separate it from the sentence with a pair of commas. So you have a comma after the name, Tim Smith, as well as after the title, MD. With numbers, of course, as you know from math class, working from the right to the left, every 3 digits you separate the numbers with a comma. That should be pretty standard for you. The hardest thing to know about commas is the idea of restrictive versus non-restrictive elements. So we've got a couple of slides here to talk about that. Sometimes groups of words, that is phrases or clauses, are used to describe a noun or pronoun. Depending on the importance of the information in the word group to understanding the sentence, these word groups may or may not be separated from the noun or pronoun with commas. So you have to make a judgment call about how important these word groups that are modifying the noun or pronoun are to your understanding. With non-restrictive elements, an element is non-restrictive if the subject can be properly identified without the addition of whatever this modifying element is. The modifying element, that is the phrase, the clause, the group of words, is simply extra information. If the element is non-restrictive, then we separate it from the rest of the sentence by commas. So if you can understand which subject we're talking about specifically without the addition of that element, you set that element off with commas because it is extra unnecessary information. So our example here, Aaron Rodgers, who is a Super Bowl winner, threw a touchdown. Well, we don't need the who is a Super Bowl winner to know specifically whom the subject of the sentence is. The subject is Aaron Rodgers. So who is a Super Bowl winner is extra. It's non-restrictive. There's enough information elsewhere in the sentence, and so we set it off with commas. On the other hand, restrictive elements are necessary. They're descriptive word groups that are essential to properly understanding the sentence. Without this element, without this phrase or clause or group of words, the reader would not be able to identify the subject accurately. Restrictive elements are not separated by commas. What you can think of is if you need the description to narrow the subject down to one specific person, place, or thing, then it is restrictive. So, the player who scored the touchdown celebrated. We've got the word group who scored the touchdown. It's restrictive because the reader needs it to identify which player. If we took it out, The player celebrated. We don't know which player. It could be any player. Who scored the touchdown narrows it down to one particular player. Thus, it's restrictive, and thus it gets no commas. Restrictive and non-restrictive elements are the hardest parts about comma usage because you have to make a judgment call. If you have questions, you should certainly ask about them in class.